The stagecoach was already burning when Sarah Whitaker crested the ridge above the Agua Fria Canyon, and she did not stop to think before she ran toward it. Smoke from the wildfires burning through the Bradshaw Mountains had turned the whole sky the color of a bruise, and the wind that afternoon in late August of 1885 kept shifting without warning, one moment pushing the haze east toward Prescott, the next doubling back to choke the canyon road in gray. It was that wind, the driver would later say, that had spooked the team, sent them bolting around a blind curve where a lantern hook had come loose and caught the canvas boot, and by the time the horses had dragged the coach into the rocks and snapped a wheel, the whole rear compartment was already licking with flame. Sarah dropped her camera case in the dirt without hesitation, hiked her skirts to her knees and ran. She had photographed fire before. 2 years earlier, in a mining camp outside Central City, Colorado, she had stood with her tripod planted and her hands steady on the shutter bulb while a boarding house burned to its foundation, telling herself that her duty was to bear witness, that someone had to record what happened so the world would believe it. She had told herself that even as a woman screamed for her children inside, even as she did nothing but watch through glass. She had made a beautiful, terrible photograph that day, and it had won her a commission, and she had never once looked at it again without her stomach turning to stone. She was not going to stand still this time. The coach driver had already been thrown clear, groaning in the rocks with a broken arm, and the horses had torn free of their traces and bolted down the grade. But there was a man still inside the cab, slumped against the door with blood running from his temple, and the fire was already crawling up the wooden frame toward him. Sarah wrenched the door handle and it would not give. She threw her shoulder against it once, twice, and on the third try it groaned open, and she got her hands under the man's arms and pulled with everything her body had. He was heavy, dead weight, and the heat against her face was already fierce enough to make her eyes stream. But she planted her boots and hauled him free just as the seat cushion behind him caught and went up in a roar of orange. She dragged him another 20 feet down the slope before her strength gave out, and she went down in the dirt beside him, both of them coughing, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly find his pulse. It was there, thin and quick, beneath her fingers at his throat. "Do not you dare," she said to him, though he could not hear her. "Do not you dare die on me after all that." He was perhaps 30 years old, she guessed, with a hard, sun-weathered face gone slack in unconsciousness, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and blood, and hands that even now, senseless, were curled into loose fists as though he had been fighting something in his sleep. His coat was good wool, town clothes, not a rancher's work clothes, though his hands when she turned one over were calloused enough to belong to a man who worked land himself. The coach driver, Mr. Higbee, dragged himself over with his broken arm cradled against his chest, and together they got the unconscious man further from the blaze, up onto a flat shelf of rock where the smoke was thinner. "That is Cyrus Underwood," Higbee said through gritted teeth, staring down at the man's face. "Homestead's out past Antelope Creek. He was coming back from Prescott, from the land office, I believe. Will he live? Head wound like that, ma'am, I could not tell you." Higbee looked at her properly for the first time, taking in her scorched sleeve, her soot-streaked face, the fact that she had run into a burning coach in a canyon while he himself had barely crawled clear of it. "You are a braver woman than most men I have driven this route with." Sarah did not feel brave. Her hands would not stop shaking, and when she looked back at the coach, now fully consumed, black smoke pouring up to join the haze already filling the canyon, she felt the same cold, hollow feeling she had felt in Colorado, except this time it was relief instead of guilt. And the difference between those two feelings was so enormous that she nearly wept from it. She had come to Arizona territory with 60 pounds of glass plates, a mahogany view camera, and a commission from the owners of the Crown King Mining Company to document the growth of their camp for investors back east who wanted proof, in pictures, that their money was building something permanent in the wilderness. She had not expected to spend her first week in the Bradshaws pulling a stranger out of a fire. Cyrus Underwood's eyes fluttered open sometime near dusk, when the wind had finally settled and the smoke had thinned enough to see the first stars struggling through the haze. He found himself looking up at a woman he did not know, her face lit orange by a small fire she had built a careful distance away, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, a streak of soot across one cheekbone that she had not noticed and would not have cared about if she had. "Where?" he managed, and then stopped, his throat raw from smoke. "You are safe," Sarah said. "There was a fire. You were in it." "You are not in it anymore." He tried to sit up and she put a hand flat against his chest, firm, unhesitating. "You have a head wound and you have been unconscious for 3 hours. You are going to lie there and drink some water before you do anything foolish like standing up." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that was not quite fear and not quite gratitude, something more like a man recalculating the shape of the world. "Who are you?" "Sarah Whitaker." "I am a photographer, traveling to Crown King. Your driver tells me your name is Cyrus Underwood, and that you have a homestead out toward Antelope Creek." "Had," Cyrus said, and something in his voice made the single word sound like a door closing. He accepted the water she offered, drank slowly, and did not explain further, and Sarah, watching him, decided not to ask. They spent that night on the rock shelf above the wreck, 3 of them and no shelter but a saddle blanket Higby had managed to save, waiting for morning when they could walk the 4 miles to Dry Wash Station and send word up the line. Cyrus drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, and twice in the night Sarah heard him say a name she did not recognize, low and broken, the name of someone he was clearly grieving. Mary. She did not ask about that either, not that night. But she filed it away, the way she filed away every detail that might someday matter, the habit of a woman who had spent years learning to see what other people missed. Dry Wash Station sat in a fold of the hills, where a spring kept a stand of cottonwoods alive year-round, a low adobe building with a corral and a barn and a garden struggling against the dry heat, all of it owned and run by a widower named Amos Kellerman, who had held the mail contract for going on 9 years. When the 3 of them came limping in the next morning, Amos took one look at Cyrus's bandaged head and the state of Sarah's scorched dress, and did not ask a single unnecessary question before putting them both to work resting. It was Amos's grandson, a solemn 8-year-old named Toby, who brought Sarah a tin cup of coffee that first morning and stood watching her with the particular unblinking attention of a child sizing up a stranger. "You pulled Mr. Underwood out of the fire," he said. "It was not a question. I did. My mama and papa died in a fire," Toby said, in the plain, unguarded way children have of stating the worst thing that ever happened to them. "Last summer. Up at the Tip-Top mine. Grandpa says it is not the same kind of fire as the wildfire kind, but I do not see how there is more than one kind of fire that kills people." Sarah set down her coffee and looked at the boy properly, at the careful stillness in his small shoulders, the way he held himself like someone bracing for a blow that had already landed and might land again. "You are right," she said. "There are not different kinds of fire, not really. Just different reasons it starts. But there are different kinds of people, and some of them will run toward a fire instead of away from it if someone they care about is inside it. Did you know Mr. Underwood before?" "No. I had never seen him before yesterday." Toby considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "Then you are one of the kind that runs toward it even for a stranger." "I suppose I am," Sarah said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that saying it aloud made something in her chest unclench that had been clenched for 2 years. Cyrus Underwood was awake and sitting up on the 3rd day, against Amos's advice, with a bandage still wrapped around his head and a bruise blooming purple down one side of his jaw. Sarah found him on the station porch in the cool of early evening, staring out at the darkening hills with an expression so distant she nearly turned around and left him to it. But he heard her boots on the boards and looked up, and something in his face eased just slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Whitaker, Mr. Underwood, You look considerably less like a corpse than you did 4 days ago. I am told I have you to thank for the fact that I am not one." He gestured at the empty chair beside him, and after a moment's consideration she took it. "Higby told me what you did. Ran into a burning coach without waiting to see if the roof would hold. I did not have time to consider whether the roof would hold. Most people would have found the time." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands. "I want to thank you properly. I have been trying to find the words for 3 days and they keep coming out smaller than what I mean. You do not need to find bigger words. I am glad you are alive. That is thanks enough for me." He studied her in the fading light, and she let him, curious what he saw. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and had spent the last 6 years traveling alone across half the West with a camera heavier than most rifles, and she had grown accustomed to men looking at her, the way one looks at a peculiar animal in a menagerie. But Cyrus Underwood did not look at her that way. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, because understanding it matters to him. "Higby said you are a photographer," he said, "bound for Crown King." "Yes, the mining company has hired me to document the camp. Investors like to see proof that their money is building something more permanent than a hole in a hillside. And what happens to that commission now that the stage is burned in a canyon? I have not decided yet. I lost 2 of my heavier plate boxes in the fire, but my camera and my best lenses were in the boot, thank God, and I salvaged what I could. I suppose I shall have to find another way over the mountain, or wait until the fire danger passes and another coach comes through." "That could be weeks," Cyrus said. "The fires up in the Bradshaws have not settled into any pattern the old-timers recognize. Wind keeps shifting. Half the mining camps up that way have already sent word down asking after supplies, and I hear tell some of the freight has gone missing entirely, which is a strange thing to hear in a summer this dry, when every wagon ought to be running double time." Something in the careful, deliberate way he said missing caught Sarah's attention, the practiced neutrality of a man choosing his words with more care than the subject seemed to warrant. "Missing how? I could not say for certain. Only that my brother holds the freight contract for half these camps, and I have learned over the years not to ask my brother too many questions I might not like the answers to." He said it lightly, but there was an old bitterness under it, worn smooth like a stone handled too many times. "You have a brother." "I have a brother," Cyrus agreed, and did not elaborate, and Sarah once again chose not to push. But she noticed the way his jaw had tightened, the way his hand had gone still on his hat, and she understood that she had touched something old and unhealed. They sat together in the deepening dusk while the cicadas took up their evening chorus, and the last color drained out of the smoke-hazed sky, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, and neither of them minded the silence. Amos Kellerman was not a man given to meddling, but he had buried a wife and a daughter, and had raised a grandson alone through one terrible summer, and something about watching Cyrus Underwood and Sarah Whitaker sit together on his porch 3 evenings running, talking in low voices about nothing of consequence and everything that mattered, put an idea into his head that he could not quite let go of. He raised it over supper on the 5th night, while Toby was outside chasing fireflies that had come out early despite the smoke, in that blunt way old men have of saying difficult things plainly, because they have run out of patience for delicacy. "Cyrus, you cannot go on living alone out at that dry parcel of yours, and Miss Whitaker cannot go on wandering this territory without a husband's name to shield her from every fool who thinks a woman traveling alone is inviting trouble. I am not saying it needs to be a love match. I am saying the land office looks kindly on a settled man with a wife when they are deciding whether to uphold a claim, and Miss Whitaker would have a home base to work from instead of sleeping in stage stations at the mercy of whatever driver happens to be sober that week." Cyrus set down his fork very carefully. "Amos, I am only saying it as I see it. You are saying Miss Whitaker and I ought to marry for convenience. I am saying it has been done before, and done well, by people with less reason to like each other than you two seem to have found in 5 days. Sarah felt her face go hot, and beside her Cyrus had gone very still in the particular way of a man holding his temper carefully in check. "I do not need a husband to protect my reputation," Sarah said, more sharply than she intended. "I have traveled 4 territories alone with 60 pounds of camera equipment, and I have not needed a man's name to do it yet. And I will not marry for a land claim, no matter how kindly meant the suggestion is, because I watched my own mother marry for convenience, and I watched what 30 years of a marriage built on nothing but arrangement did to her. I would rather sleep in stage stations until I am 80 than do that to myself." Cyrus looked at her, and there was something in his face that she could not quite name, relief perhaps or recognition. "I will not marry again for a piece of paper," he said, quiet but very final. "I had a wife I loved, Amos. Her name was Mary, and she has been 2 years in the ground, and I will not stand up in front of a preacher and say vows to a stranger just to satisfy a land office clerk, no matter what it might do for my case." Amos held up both hands, chastened. "I meant no offense to either of you. Only that I have watched you both circling each other like 2 people who have already decided something they have not said aloud, and I thought I would spare you both the trouble of pretending otherwise." "We have known each other 5 days," Sarah said. "I have known men to marry on less," Amos said mildly, and returned to his supper, and left the 2 of them sitting in a silence that was considerably less comfortable than the silences that had come before it. Though underneath the discomfort, if either of them had examined it honestly, there was something else stirring too, something that neither of them was ready yet to name. The subject of the missing freight did not stay buried for long. 2 days later, a rider came down out of the Bradshaws at a hard gallop, a young teamster named Willits who worked for the Crown King Company, and he arrived at Dry Wash Station with his horse lathered white and his voice cracking with more than exhaustion. "The camp is near out of everything," he said, swallowing water Amos handed him in gulps. "Flour, medicine, blasting powder, all of it. There was a supply train due up from Prescott 11 days back, 12 wagons, and it never arrived. The foreman sent men down the road to look, and there is no sign of it, no wreck, no tracks leading off where it ought to have gone. Just gone like it walked off the earth. And now the fire has closed the North Road entirely, and if we do not get supplies up that mountain inside the week, folks are going to start walking down on foot, straight through fire country, because there will be nothing left to eat." Cyrus, who had been mending a section of fence when the rider came in, set down his tools and walked over with an expression Sarah had not seen on him before, something sharpened and alert where before there had only been quiet grief. "12 wagons do not vanish, Willits, who held the contract for that run." Willits looked uncomfortable. "Underwood Freight, same as always. My brother's company." "I'm not accusing anybody of anything, Mr. Underwood. I'm only telling you what the foreman told me to tell whoever I found first on the road." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah watched something settle over his face like a man making a decision he had been avoiding for a long time. "I failed to stop him once before," he said, mostly to himself, though Sarah heard it. "I let him take what was mine because I was too deep in grief to fight for it properly, and I told myself that was the end of the matter, that I would just live small and quiet on what was left and let him have the rest of it. I'm not going to make that mistake twice, not when there are children up that mountain who are going to go hungry for it." "What do you mean to do?" Sarah asked. "I mean to find those wagons," Cyrus said, "and I would be obliged, Miss Whitaker, if you would come with me and bring that camera of yours." Sarah looked at him and understood with a small thrill that was equal parts fear and something warmer, exactly what he was asking of her, and exactly what it might cost them both. "Give me 20 minutes to load my plates," she said. They rode out from Dry Wash Station the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, Cyrus on a sturdy bay gelding he had borrowed from Amos, Sarah on a mule that could carry her camera boxes without complaint, both of them following a set of directions Willits had scratched into the dirt with a stick before he rode on to spread the alarm at Fort Whipple. The theory, such as it was, held that a freight train bound for Crown King from Prescott would have followed the main canyon road until it reached the fork at Bell Rock, and somewhere between there and the camp, 12 loaded wagons had simply ceased to exist. The land through which they rode was rugged and beautiful and increasingly choked with smoke, the Bradshaw Peaks rising up ahead of them wreathed in gray, the air smelling of char and hot resin. Twice, they had to detour around sections of trail where fire had crept close enough to leave the brush blackened and smoldering, and once they passed a family of homesteaders fleeing down the mountain with everything they owned piled onto a single wagon, faces gray with smoke and fear. "It is worse than I thought," Cyrus said, watching the family pass. "If the fire cuts the south road too, Crown King will be trapped up there with no way down and no supplies to wait it out." "How well do you know your brother's operation?" Cyrus was quiet for a while before he answered. "Well enough to know that Jacob has never once in his life missed an opportunity to profit from other people's desperation. When our father died 3 years back, Jacob had power of attorney while I was burying my wife, and by the time I came back from that burying, he had filed papers with the land office claiming the whole of our father's homestead in his own name, water rights and all, leaving me the dry ridge parcel with no creek access worth mentioning. I fought it in the courts for 2 years and lost the appeal not 8 days ago, the week before that stage caught fire with me in it. I have spent 3 years telling myself I would find a way to make peace with losing that land, and every single day it has felt less like peace and more like defeat." Sarah rode beside him in silence for a moment, letting the weight of what he had told her settle. "That is not a small thing to carry alone," she said finally. "No," Cyrus agreed. "It is not. I have found it easier these 2 years to simply not carry anyone else's weight along with mine, easier to keep my circle small. My wife is gone, my land is half stolen, and I decided somewhere in there that the safest thing a man could do was want less, need less, so there would be less left for the world to take from him." He glanced sideways at her, something rueful in his expression. "I am aware that is not a particularly romantic philosophy to admit to a woman I have known less than 2 weeks. I have built a similar philosophy for myself," Sarah admitted. "Mine involves a camera instead of a fence line, but the shape of it is the same. Stand back far enough and nothing can burn you. And has it worked?" "Less than I would like to admit," Sarah said, and found she meant it more than she had expected to. They reached the fork at Bell Rock by early afternoon, and it took another 2 hours of careful searching along the game trails branching off the main road before Sarah, whose eye had been trained for 6 years to notice what did not belong in a landscape, spotted it. A section of brush along a dry wash that had been cut and dragged into place too neatly to be natural, concealing what looked like the mouth of a narrow side canyon. "There," she said, pointing. "That brush has been arranged. No wind does that." They dismounted and led the animals in on foot, and there, hidden in a box canyon barely wide enough to admit a single wagon, sat 11 freight wagons in a neat row, tarped and abandoned, guarded by 2 men Sarah did not recognize sitting in the shade of a linta with rifles across their knees. Cyrus's hand went instinctively to the pistol at his hip, but Sarah caught his wrist before he could draw it. "Wait," she whispered. "We do not know how many more of them there are, and we do not know this ground. If this goes wrong, we lose everything, including whatever proof is sitting in those wagons. What do you propose?" Sarah's mind was already working, the same cold, clear focus that came over her behind a camera lens, the part of her that had learned to see a whole scene at once and understand what mattered inside it. "I propose I do what I came here to do. I photograph it. If I can get close enough to expose 2 plates of those wagons and those men before they know we are here, we will have proof no land office or fort commander can argue with, whatever happens next. Sarah, if they see you, they will not see me. Trust me." He looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not quite fear and not quite faith but some new alloy of both, forged in that instant of decision. "All right," he said. "I trust you." She worked quickly and silently, the way she had learned to work in mining camps where men did not always want their faces recorded, setting her small field camera on its collapsible tripod behind a boulder at the canyon mouth, adjusting the lens with fingers that did not shake despite her hammering heart, and exposing 2 plates in careful succession before easing the tripod legs shut and retreating. They were nearly clear of the canyon mouth when a loose stone rolled under Cyrus's boot and clattered down the slope, and one of the guards came up off his crate with his rifle already rising. "Who is there?" Cyrus stepped out from cover with his hands open and visible, putting himself between the guard's rifle and Sarah in a single unhesitating motion that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Easy now," Cyrus said. "We are not looking for trouble, just lost travelers who wandered off the main road." "Nobody wanders into Widow's Canyon by accident," the second guard said, circling wide to flank them, and Sarah felt her pulse spike with real fear now, the kind that had nothing to do with cameras and everything to do with the 2 rifles pointed steadily at the man standing in front of her. "Widow's Canyon," Cyrus repeated. "That would put us on Jacob Underwood's land then." "Which is convenient, since I am his brother, and I have come looking for a supply train that seems to have gone missing on its way to Crown King." The first guard's eyes flickered just slightly with recognition and unease. Mr. Underwood does not take kindly to being spied on by kin, especially kin he has had a falling out with. "I imagine he does not," Cyrus said. "You can tell him I said so." It was, Sarah would later realize, a bluff of extraordinary nerve, a man standing unarmed between 2 rifles and staking his safety on the fact that his brother's hired men would hesitate to shoot family in cold blood, at least without instructions to do so first. It worked, but only just, and only long enough for the guards to lower their rifles a fraction while they argued between themselves about what to do, giving Cyrus and Sarah the half-second of confusion they needed to back toward their animals and swing up into the saddles. "Ride," Cyrus said, low and urgent, and they did, breaking from the canyon mouth at a hard gallop with shouts rising behind them, and a moment later, the flat crack of a rifle shot that went wide into the rocks. They did not stop riding until the canyon walls had risen up around them on the old mining road that wound along the shoulder of the mountain above the main canyon, a narrow shelf trail barely wide enough for a single wagon, cut into the cliff face by miners 2 decades earlier, and maintained since by nothing but luck and infrequent traffic. It was, Sarah understood with a lurch of dread, exactly the kind of ground where one wrong turn meant a fall of 200 feet onto rocks below, and it was exactly the ground their pursuers chose to force them onto. 4 riders came around the bend behind them, Jacob Underwood's men, faces set hard, and ahead of them the shelf trail narrowed further where a rockslide had taken a bite out of the outer edge sometime in the past season. "Cyrus, the trail narrows ahead." "I see it. Stay close to the rock face, give your mule her head. She will find her footing better than you can find it for her." The world narrowed to hoofbeats and dust, and the terrible drop yawning at Sarah's left knee as her mule picked its way along a strip of trail that could not have been more than 4 feet wide, loose stone skittering away into empty air with every step. Behind them the pursuing riders had slowed, unwilling to press their horses onto ground that treacherous at speed, but one man, bolder or more desperate than the rest, kept coming, and Sarah heard Cyrus shout something behind her, heard the crack of a shot, and felt her mule startle sideways with a scream. For one endless, suspended second, the animal's hooves scrabbled at the crumbling edge of the trail, and Sarah felt her whole body tip toward the drop, her camera case slamming hard against her hip, and she grabbed for the saddle horn with both hands and screamed a word that was not quite a prayer. Then Cyrus was there somehow, his gelding pressed in tight against her mule's flank, one strong arm hooked around her waist and hauling her sideways against him even as his own horse fought for footing on the narrow shelf, and for one terrible, glorious moment the two of them were pressed together astride two animals balanced on a knife's edge above a canyon, his heartbeat hammering against her back, his voice low and fierce in her ear. "I have you. I have you, Sarah. Do not let go." The mule found its footing again. Or perhaps it was simply luck. Or perhaps it was the steadying weight of Cyrus's horse beside it. And the moment of catastrophe passed as quickly as it had come, leaving both animals trembling and both riders breathing hard. And behind them their remaining pursuer, having seen what nearly happened, reined in his horse and did not follow further onto that shelf of trail. They rode on in silence until the trail widened again and dropped down into a stand of pine where the smoke was thinner, and only then did Cyrus finally release his hold on her, though his hand lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary at her waist before he drew back, and when Sarah turned to look at him she found him watching her with an expression of such raw, unguarded feeling that she forgot entirely how to breathe. "You could have been killed," he said, hoarse. "So could you, riding in like that. I could not watch you go over that edge, Sarah. I could not." He stopped, seemed to hear what he had said, and looked almost startled by it. "I have spent 2 years telling myself I did not want to need anyone that much again. It appears I was wrong about that." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built stone by careful stone over 6 years of traveling alone, of watching from behind glass, of telling herself that distance was the same thing as safety. "I have spent 6 years telling myself the same lie," she said softly. "I think we may both need to stop telling it." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them. Not yet, not with pursuers somewhere behind and a mountain full of hungry people ahead of them. But something had shifted in the space between their two horses. Some understanding reached without a single further word needing to be said, and they rode the rest of the way down toward Dry Wash Station in a silence that felt, for the first time since Sarah had met him, entirely peaceful. They arrived back at the station well after dark, exhausted, smoke-stained, and Sarah's mule limping slightly from the near fall. And Amos took one look at their faces and did not ask questions until he had fed them both and Toby had gone to bed. "We found the wagons," Cyrus said, once the boy was safely asleep. "Jacob has them hidden in Widow's Canyon, guarded, and I have no doubt now that he means to sit on that freight until the mining camps are desperate enough to pay whatever price he sets when he finally lets it through, if he lets it through at all before winter, and I would not put it past him to be selling portions of it quietly to other buyers even now." "That is not mere greed," Amos said grimly. "Men have died in fire evacuations before now for want of a wagon of medicine, arriving a day too late. If Crown King runs out of water and food before that fire cuts the South Road entirely, folks are going to try to walk down on foot straight into fire country." Sarah photographed the wagons and the guards. "It is proof, if we can get it in front of the right people before Jacob has time to move them or destroy the evidence." "The right people meaning who?" "The sheriff in Prescott owes half his re-election to Jacob's mercantile contracts. You will need someone with authority Jacob cannot buy." "Lieutenant Hargrove at Fort Whipple," Cyrus said slowly. "The army has its own interest in that supply line, since half of what Jacob diverted was bound for the fort as well as the mining camp. If we can reach Hargrove with the photographs and enough evidence to justify a patrol, he has the men and the authority to reclaim those wagons by force if it comes to that, and the standing to see Jacob prosecuted regardless of who he has paid off in the civilian courts. That is a full day's ride from here, and the fire is closing roads faster than any of us can track them," Amos said. "You mean to leave tomorrow?" "I mean to leave tonight," Cyrus said. "There is no time left to spend sleeping." Sarah, who had thought she was too exhausted to feel anything but the ache in her own bones, found herself standing without hesitation. "Then, I am coming with you. Those photographs are useless as evidence unless I can speak to their provenance, and I have been trusted as a witness in territorial courts before this. Besides," she added, with a small, tired smile that nonetheless reached all the way to her eyes, "somebody has to keep pulling you out of trouble, Mr. Underwood. It appears to have become something of a habit of mine. Fort Whipple sat on a rise outside Prescott, its whitewashed buildings ghostly in the smoke-hazed moonlight when Cyrus and Sarah rode in near dawn, having pushed their tired horses through the night along roads made treacherous by drifting ash and the constant threat of flame breaking through the dark hills to either side. Lieutenant Hargrove, a lean, sun-weathered officer who had clearly not slept properly in days himself, given the state of the territory, received them in his office with the wary patience of a man accustomed to civilians arriving with wild claims, until Sarah laid the 2 glass plates on his desk, and he held them up to the lamp and saw, unmistakably, 11 Army-marked freight wagons sitting idle in a hidden canyon under armed guard. "These are Army supplies," he said, his voice gone tight and cold. "Marked crates, I can see the stenciling even in this poor light. Mr. Underwood, are you telling me your brother has been sitting on government freight while this territory burns?" "I am telling you exactly that, Lieutenant, and I am telling you he has men enough to defend that canyon against anyone who comes asking politely." "Then we will not ask politely." Hargrove was already reaching for his hat, shouting orders through the door for his sergeant to rouse a patrol. "I can have 20 men mounted within the hour. Mr. Underwood, Miss Whitaker, I will want you both to ride with us as witnesses if you have the strength left for it." "We have the strength," Sarah said, before Cyrus could even answer, and he looked at her with an expression of such fierce, grateful pride that she felt it warm her clear through despite the exhaustion dragging at every limb. They rode out from Fort Whipple as the sun finally broke weakly through the smoke haze to the east, 20 cavalrymen and 2 civilians who had, in the space of 8 days, become considerably more than strangers to each other, and the ride back up into the Bradshaws felt entirely different this time, not a desperate flight from danger, but a deliberate reckoning with it. Jacob Underwood was not at Widow's Canyon when they arrived. He was, Hargrove's advance scouts reported, at his mercantile office in Prescott, apparently unaware that his hidden freight had already been discovered once and photographed, and entirely unprepared for a cavalry patrol descending on his hired guards, who surrendered their rifles without a shot, fired the moment they saw the number of soldiers riding down on them. It was Cyrus who insisted they ride straight back to Prescott rather than wait for Hargrove to send for Jacob through official channels. "I have spent 3 years letting my brother decide the terms of every reckoning between us," he told Sarah, as they rode back down out of the mountains with the recovered wagons rolling along behind under armed escort, bound at last for Crown King and the fort both. "I do not intend to let him decide this one too." They found Jacob Underwood in the back office of Underwood Freight and Mercantile, a solidly built man some 4 years older than Cyrus with the same dark hair going gray at the temples, the same set to his jaw, though where Cyrus's face had been shaped by grief and hard land into something weathered and watchful, Jacob's had been shaped by comfort and ambition into something smooth and self-satisfied, at least until he looked up from his ledger and saw who was standing in his doorway. Flanked by an army lieutenant and a woman he did not recognize, Cyrus, his voice was careful, testing the ground. "I heard you were in a stage accident. I am glad to see you well. Are you?" Cyrus's voice was flat. "I have just come from Widow's Canyon, Jacob. I have seen the wagons. I have photographs of the wagons and of the men you paid to guard them, and Lieutenant Hargrove here has already recovered them under military authority, since a portion of that freight belonged to the United States Army, and you have been sitting on it for 11 days while children up at Crown King went hungry, and a fire closed in around them." Jacob's face went through several rapid changes, calculation, denial, and finally something that might almost have been fear, before settling into a defensive, wounded anger that Cyrus recognized from a lifetime of watching his brother talk his way out of trouble. "You do not understand the position I was in. The price of freight in a fire season, the risk to my drivers, I was simply waiting for a fair rate. You were starving mining camps for profit, and using the panic to pressure homesteaders along the route into selling you their water claims cheap, the way you pressured me 3 years ago when you took father's land while I was burying my wife." Cyrus's voice had not risen, but something in it had gone hard and final. "I have the letters, Jacob. I found them in your own ledger at Widow's Canyon, the ones you wrote to Prude at the land office arranging for father's signature to be witnessed by a man who was 3 counties away the week it was supposedly signed. I have known for years that you cheated me. I have proof of it now that a court cannot argue with." Lieutenant Hargrove stepped forward. "Jacob Underwood, I am placing you under arrest for the theft and diversion of United States Army supplies, pending further charges to be determined by the territorial court regarding fraud and land theft, on evidence provided by your brother and Miss Whitaker here." Jacob's composure finally broke entirely. He came around the desk, not toward the lieutenant but toward Cyrus, his hands raised, his face suddenly stripped of every careful calculation, showing underneath it something raw and frightened, and for the first time in longer than Cyrus could remember, entirely honest. "Cyrus, please. I know what I did to you. I have known it every day for 3 years and told myself you would find a way to manage without that land, that you were always the stronger one, the one who did not need as much to be content. I told myself a great many things to make it easier to live with. If this goes to trial, I lose everything, the business, the contracts, all of it, and I will not survive prison, Cyrus. I am not built for it the way you are built for hardship. I am asking you, brother to brother, for whatever that is worth to you now, to speak for leniency." Sarah watched Cyrus's face, watched the years of banked anger and grief war visibly with something else, something that had been growing quietly in him across the last 8 days of fire and fear and unexpected tenderness, and she found she could not breathe for wondering which would win. "You stole my father's land," Cyrus said slowly. "You let me grieve my wife alone in a house with no water rights because you decided I was strong enough to manage without asking whether I wanted to be. You let children go hungry on a mountain while fire closed in around them, for money you did not need. I do not know if I can forgive that, Jacob. I have spent 3 years hating you for it, and hate is a heavy thing to set down all at once." He was quiet for a long moment, and the office was silent except for the distant sound of Prescott's ordinary morning traffic outside, wagons and horses and voices, a world entirely unaware of the reckoning happening in this small back room. "But I watched a woman run into a burning stagecoach 8 days ago without stopping to think about what it might cost her," Cyrus continued, his eyes finding Sarah's across the room. "And I have spent every day since learning something I had forgotten, which is that carrying hatred and grief alone does not protect a man from loss. It only guarantees he faces it without anyone beside him. I do not know if I can forgive you today, Jacob. But I am done letting what you did to me decide who I am going to become. I will not ask the lieutenant to go easy on you for the army theft, because that is not mine to forgive. That belongs to every family up at Crown King who went hungry for your greed. But I will not stand here and wish you the worst either. I will testify to the truth, all of it, the land and the freight both, and let the court decide what is fair. And when it is done, however it is done, I think I am finally ready to let go of hating you for it. Not because you deserve it, Jacob, because I do." It was not, Sarah understood, a full reconciliation, not a warm embrace between brothers restored to each other, and it did not need to be. It was something harder and more honest than that. A man choosing, deliberately and with clear eyes, to set down a weight he had carried so long he had mistaken its familiar ache for the shape of his own heart. Jacob's eyes filled, and he did not try to hide it, and Lieutenant Hargrove, with more gentleness than Sarah would have expected from a soldier, waited a respectful moment before stepping forward to complete the arrest. The territorial court proceedings, when they came some weeks later, restored the whole of the Antelope Creek homestead to Cyrus's name, water rights included, on the strength of the forged witness testimony and Jacob's own ledger entries, and Jacob Underwood pleaded guilty to the freight diversion charges in exchange for a reduced sentence at the territorial prison in Yuma. A sentence Cyrus, true to his word, did not attempt to lengthen with testimony harsher than the plain facts required, though neither did he lie to soften it. But that reckoning still lay some weeks distant on the morning they rode back out of Prescott together, the immediate crisis resolved, the wagons rolling on toward Crown King under Army escort, and Cyrus and Sarah found themselves, for the first time since the stagecoach fire, with nothing more urgent demanding their attention than the road ahead of them and the smoke-softened light of a Bradshaw Mountain afternoon. "You said something back there," Sarah said, as they let their tired horses walk at an easy pace along the wagon road, "about learning something from watching me run into that fire." "I said a great many things back there. I am not sure my head has entirely caught up to all of them yet. You said carrying grief alone does not protect a person from loss, only guarantees they face it without anyone beside them." Cyrus was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead, and when he spoke again his voice had lost the hard edge it had carried in his brother's office and gone soft in a way she had not heard from him before. "I built a whole philosophy of living after Mary died around the idea that solitude was the same thing as peace, that if I kept my circle small enough, wanted little enough, needed no one enough, then nothing could ever hurt me the way losing her hurt me. I told myself that for 2 years and called it wisdom. And then a woman ran into a burning coach to save a man she had never met, and stood photographing armed guards from behind a boulder without her hands shaking, and hauled me sideways off a cliff shelf without a moment's hesitation for her own safety. And I realized somewhere in the last 8 days that what I had built was not peace at all. It was just a smaller, quieter kind of grief, dressed up to look like contentment." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I built something similar. I told myself that standing behind a camera and bearing witness was a form of courage, and perhaps it is, but I also used it as a wall, Cyrus. A reason never to be the one running into the fire myself, never to risk anything I could not frame and develop and set carefully aside in a box. I do not know when exactly that changed. Perhaps it was the moment I saw your coach burning and did not stop to think. Perhaps it happened before that, and I only noticed it then." They had stopped their horses without quite meaning to, facing each other in the dappled shade of a stand of oak beside the road, the smoke-hazed light turning everything around them soft and golden, and Cyrus reached across the space between their 2 horses and took her hand, his rough, work-hardened fingers closing gently around hers. "Amos was not entirely wrong, you know," he said, "when he suggested we marry, even if he went about it in the clumsiest possible way. I think some part of him saw what neither of us was ready yet to admit. He suggested it as a business arrangement, a convenience. I am not asking you as a convenience, Sarah." His thumb moved slowly across her knuckles, and she felt the touch of it everywhere at once. "I am asking because I have spent 8 days watching you be brave and clever and unbearably kind in the middle of the worst crisis this territory has seen in years, and because somewhere in that time I stopped being a widowed man mistaking solitude for peace, and started being a man who cannot imagine riding this road, or any road, without you beside him. I am not offering you a land claim or a housekeeper's position or anyone's protection. I am offering you whatever is left of my heart, such as it is, still a little scorched around the edges but entirely, freely yours if you will have it." Sarah felt tears rise, unexpected and entirely welcome, and she did not try to blink them away. "I have spent 6 years telling myself that a woman who wants to see the world clearly cannot afford to love anyone too much, because love makes a person want to look away from hard things to protect what they cannot bear to lose. But I have watched you these 8 days too, Cyrus. I have watched you stand between me and a rifle without a moment's hesitation, and choose mercy over hatred in the hardest moment of your life, and I do not think loving you would make me look away from anything. I think it might be the first time in years I have felt entirely, clearly awake, She turned her hand in his so their fingers laced together properly. Yes. My answer is yes, if you are asking what I think you are asking, though I would ask that you ask it properly, on a day when neither of us smells quite so strongly of wood smoke. Cyrus laughed. A real laugh startled out of him, the first she had heard from him since the accident, and it transformed his whole face into something so unguarded and joyful that she felt her heart turn over entirely. I will ask you properly, he said. I promise you that. But I find I cannot wait for a better occasion to do this. He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, gently at first, questioning, and when she answered it without hesitation, deepening, both of them laughing against each other's mouths at the awkward business of leaning sideways out of two separate saddles, until Cyrus finally swung down from his horse and reached up to lift her down from hers, and they stood together in the road with the smoke-softened sunlight falling through the oak leaves, kissing properly this time, unhurried. With all the tenderness of two people who had each spent years believing they did not need what they had just found. They stayed 3 more weeks at Dry Wash Station while the fires burned themselves out in the higher elevations, and the first autumn rains finally came to lay the smoke. Weeks in which Sarah completed her commission for the Crown King Mining Company, riding up the mountain with Cyrus at her side to photograph the recovering camp, the grateful faces of families who had feared starvation and instead found relief arriving in army wagons, and weeks in which the courtship that had begun in fire and danger deepened into something unhurried and sweet in the ordinary business of daily life, evening walks along the creek that ran, at last, freely onto Cyrus's restored land, long conversations on the station porch that ranged from grief to hope to the small, foolish, delighted things new lovers discover about each other, the way Sarah hummed without noticing when she worked, the way Cyrus's careful hands, so steady with rope and rifle, turned suddenly clumsy and shy the first time he tried to help her carry a plate box down from the wagon and dropped his hat instead. Toby Kellerman, who had watched the growing romance with the frank interest of a child who had decided early on that he approved of it, took to following Cyrus around the station whenever the man came to call, asking endless questions about homesteading and horses, and once, with startling directness, whether Cyrus meant to marry Sarah and whether, if he did, Toby might come visit sometimes, since his grandfather was getting old and Toby had begun to worry in the quiet, careful way of a child who has already lost too much, about what would happen to him if Amos grew too frail to keep the station. Cyrus had knelt down to the boy's level at that, and answered him with the same seriousness he would have given a grown man's question. I do mean to marry her, Toby, if she will still have me once the courting is properly done. And you will always be welcome at Antelope Creek, whatever happens with your grandfather, because a boy who lost his mother and father to fire and still finds the courage to ask a hard question plainly deserves a family who will answer him honestly, always. It was Amos himself, some weeks later, who raised the matter formally, sitting Cyrus and Sarah down together on the station porch with the particular gravity of a man who had thought long and carefully about what he was about to say. I am not a young man, he said, and this last year has taken more out of me than I like to admit, chasing after a boy of 8 while running a station that never sleeps. I have a sister in Tucson who has offered more than once to take me in, and I have begun to think it might be time to accept, but I cannot go anywhere while Toby has no one else. I have watched the two of you with him these past weeks. I have watched him ask you both, in his own quiet way, whether he might belong somewhere permanent. I am asking you plainly, as I asked you plainly about marriage before, though I hope you will find this suggestion considerably more welcome. Would you consider raising him, once you are married and settled? I do not ask it lightly, and I would not ask it at all if I did not believe with my whole heart that the two of you would love that boy the way he deserves to be loved. Sarah looked at Cyrus and found in his face the same answer already forming in her own heart, and she reached for his hand before either of them spoke a word aloud. We would be honored, Cyrus said, his voice thick. Then honored. I have an empty house that has needed a child's laughter in it for 2 years longer than I let myself admit, and I think Sarah would tell you the same about wanting a family of her own to come home to between commissions. I would tell you exactly that, Sarah said, smiling through sudden tears. Toby will always have a home with us, Amos. For as long as he wants one, which I suspect, given how thoroughly he has already claimed Cyrus as his own personal project, may well be forever. They were married in October, when the last of the smoke had cleared entirely, and the Bradshaw hillsides had begun to show the first green shoots of recovery pushing up through blackened ground. A small ceremony held on the porch of the newly repaired homestead at Antelope Creek, with Amos standing as witness, Toby scrubbed and solemn in a borrowed collar, serving as ring-bearer with the fierce concentration of a boy determined not to fail at his one assigned duty, and Lieutenant Hargrove, who had become an unlikely friend to them, both through the ordeal of the trial testimony, riding out from the fort to stand as a second witness, alongside a small gathering of neighbors who had heard the whole story by then and come to see for themselves the homestead finally restored to its rightful owner. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue that Amos's sister had sent up from Tucson for the occasion, and carried, instead of flowers, a small bouquet of the wild sunflowers that had begun blooming again along the creek bank now that the water ran free onto Underwood land for the first time in 3 years. Cyrus stood waiting for her beneath the cottonwood tree where he had once, as a boy, watched his own father plant the first fence posts of a homestead that had nearly slipped forever from the family's hands. And when Sarah came to stand beside him, her camera left behind for once, her hands empty of everything but the flowers and his fingers when he reached for them, he could not entirely keep the tears from his eyes. "I built a whole life," he said, when it came time for him to speak his vows, departing from whatever careful words he might have planned, around the idea that solitude was the safest thing a grieving man could choose. "I was wrong about that, Sarah, more wrong than I have ever been wrong about anything, and I am grateful every single day that a woman brave enough to run into a burning stagecoach did not let me stay wrong about it. I promise to build with you, not just a home, though I promise you that too, but a life wide open enough to hold everything we are both capable of, your work and mine, your courage and mine, and whatever family we build together starting today with a boy who has already claimed both our hearts. I love you. I will keep choosing to love you out loud every day for the rest of whatever years we are given." Sarah, for her part, had spent 6 years learning to see the world clearly through glass and silver and careful chemistry, and she found, when it came her turn to speak, that the truest thing she had ever seen was standing directly in front of her, needing no lens at all to bring it into focus. "I came to this territory to document other people's lives," she said, believing that watching from a careful distance was its own kind of courage. "I have learned this autumn that the greater courage is choosing to step into the frame yourself, to let yourself be seen as fully as you see others, to let someone else's hand steady yours on a cliff edge and trust that it will hold. Cyrus, you have already shown me what it looks like to forgive the deepest wound a person can carry, and to choose love and mercy even when hatred would have been easier and perhaps more deserved. I promise to be worthy of standing beside a man with that kind of courage. I promise to keep running toward the fire, Cyrus, for you, for Toby, for whatever this life brings us, for as long as I live." They were pronounced married as the last of the autumn light fell gold through the cottonwood leaves, and when Cyrus kissed his bride, Toby let out a whoop of delight that startled the horses in the corral and set every adult present laughing, and Amos wiped his eyes with the back of one weathered hand and thought that his daughter, wherever she was, would have been glad to see her son so thoroughly and permanently claimed by love. They settled into the homestead at Antelope Creek together in the weeks that followed, Sarah converting the old tack room into a darkroom where she could develop her plates by lamplight, her photographs of the Bradshaw mining camps eventually finding their way not only to the investors who had commissioned them, but to newspapers as far away as San Francisco, where editors ran her images of the fire recovery, alongside accounts of the freight scandal and the land fraud trial, giving voice at last to an injustice that might otherwise have been buried quietly by men with money enough to buy silence. Cyrus rebuilt his fences and dug new irrigation channels from the creek that finally, rightfully, ran onto his land, and in the evenings when the work was done, he and Sarah would sit on the porch with Toby between them, the boy narrating elaborate stories about the horses or asking earnest questions about photography that Sarah answered with endless patience, and the three of them would watch the sun go down gold and orange, no longer the color of smoke and danger, but simply the ordinary, extraordinary color of an Arizona evening, safe and whole and entirely, finally home. Jacob Underwood served 3 years at the territorial prison in Yuma before his release, and though Cyrus did not seek him out in the years that followed, he did not close the door entirely either. A letter came once a year at Christmas, brief and careful, and Cyrus answered each one, brief and careful in return. Two brothers who might never again be close, but who had, in the end, both found a way to set down a weight too heavy to carry forever. It was not the reconciliation of storybooks, warm and complete, but it was honest, and it was enough. And Cyrus found that having forgiven what could not be undone left him lighter in ways he had not expected, free to pour the whole of his heart into the family he had built instead of the grievance he had finally released. Sarah never did stop running toward the things that frightened her, though she found, in the years that followed, that she rarely needed to run alone. She photographed the rebuilding of Crown King as it grew from a rough mining camp into a proper town, photographed her own growing family gathered on the porch at Antelope Creek, photographed Cyrus teaching Toby to read brand marks on cattle and Toby teaching Cyrus, in turn, an endless patience for a boy's questions that Cyrus had not known he possessed until love required it of him. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the boy was asleep, she and Cyrus would walk together along the creek that ran free at last through land that was, in every sense that mattered, entirely and finally theirs. And Cyrus would sometimes stop and simply look at her in the fading light, still faintly disbelieving of his own good fortune. "I mistook solitude for peace for 2 long years," he told her once, on just such an evening, the creek murmuring beside them and the first stars coming out clean and clear in a sky finally free of smoke. "I am glad every single day that you burned that mistake to the ground. I am glad every single day that you were worth running into the fire for," Sarah answered, and kissed him there in the last light of an Arizona evening, home at last, both of them, in the one place they had never quite let themselves believe they would find each other.